Hey guys, welcome back to Boring History for Sleep, where history lies down, tucks itself in, and sometimes sleepwalks into the annals of the strange. Tonight, we begin a quietly curious stroll through a forgotten corridor of legal history, the shadowy world of sleepwalking murders. Yes, murders, perpetrated by the unconscious, crimes of the deeply snoozy kind. Now, before you lock your bedroom door and wrap yourself in bubble wrap, let's take a calming breath and remind ourselves, very few people commit violence in their sleep. Most of us are more likely to accidentally snuggle a pillow too hard or mumble to an imaginary squirrel. But every so often, history hands us someone who insists their nightly journey led them out of bed and into a courtroom. Let's slowly open that creaky old file drawer marked somnambulistic shenanigans and ease into our first file. A nice crisp case from relatively recent memory. It's the year 1987. The Cold War is cooling, hair is big, socks are slouchy, and in a sleepy suburb of Toronto, Canada, a man named Kenneth Parks is about to create one of the most controversial courtroom defenses the Western legal system has ever seen. Kenneth is 23 years old, married, a father, and recently unemployed. He has a gambling problem, the kind that doesn't stay neatly tucked under the rug. On a particularly stressful night, he gets into his car at 4:30 in the morning, drives 14 miles to his in-laws' house, and, according to police reports, commits a terrifying and violent act. Let's pause here, not for suspense, for softness, because our focus, as always, is not to sensationalize, but to understand gently. After the incident, Kenneth drives straight to a police station, covered in blood, confused and distraught, and says, "I think I may have killed someone." Calm down, heart rate. We're sinking into history now, not true crime shorts. What makes this case so historically sleepy is Kenneth's defense. He claims he was asleep the whole time, the entire drive, the entire event, completely unconscious. The term is automatism, not the punchy Transformers kind, but the sleepy, involuntary kind. A person in a state where their body acts without conscious control. Now, before you scoff your bedtime tea, some evidence supported this strange defense. Sleep experts at the trial found that Kenneth had a long history of parasomnia, complex behaviors while asleep, including frequent night terrors, sleep talking, and episodes of sleepwalking. The defense argued that stress from his failing finances, coupled with sleep deprivation, had triggered a freak incident of what's called non-insane automatism. Essentially, his brain was asleep. His body just didn't get the memo. Forensic sleep studies recorded rare and specific patterns in Kenneth's brain. During sleep, it seemed his brain could initiate complex motor activities, like unlocking doors, turning on lights, even driving, without conscious awareness. So what happened? In a stunning legal move, Kenneth Parks was acquitted. The jury accepted the argument that he had in fact committed the act, but without criminal intent and without being awake. The case set a precedent, gently rocking the legal community like a baby in a canoe. It left people asking strange new questions. Can someone sleep drive? Apparently yes. Can someone attack without awareness? Sort of. Rarely. Very rarely. And should the rest of us sleep in separate rooms just in case? Probably not necessary, unless your partner also sleep cooks with chainsaws. The Kenneth Parks case remains one of the most controversial examples of sleepwalking as a legal defense. Some hailed it as a triumph of science in the courtroom. Others saw it, as you might imagine, as a door flung open for excuses slipperier than satin sheets. But, like all curious stories from history, it doesn't exist in a vacuum. It arose from context, medical, cultural, and legal, bubbling and brewing beneath the surface of society's slumbering logic. As we tuck this case file back into our whispering drawer, we're left with a gentle question to ponder into the cooler side of our pillow. Was this the only time sleepwalking walked itself into the courtroom? Oh no, my friend. In Chapter 2, we're heading further back, centuries back in fact, to when courts didn't have neurology experts, and everyone hoped their neighbours simply wouldn't burst out of their house like medieval sleep burglars. Stay cozy, and I'll see you in the next page of Peculiar Slumber. The year was 1987. Shoulder pads reigned supreme, cassette tapes ruled the car stereo, and Canadians still apologized profusely for everything, even for living next to Americans. Kenneth Parks was a 23-year-old husband, father, former municipal worker, and, as we mentioned, a sleepwalker of impressive commitment. Now, Kenny had a few things going on. He'd recently lost his job due to a compulsive gambling problem, was under financial strain, and was due to tell his in-laws, whom he dearly loved, about the pickle he'd landed himself in. A stressful stew for anyone, let alone the subconscious mind of a somnambulist. But what happened one early morning in May was far beyond the usual midnight fridge raiding or half-awake shoe rearrangement. Kenneth Parks got in his car and drove, nearly 20 kilometers. Not a jog, not a moody saunter. He actually drove his car while asleep to his in-laws' home in the sleepy suburbs of Scarborough. Let's pause here to let that sink in. That's 15 minutes of unconscious cruise control. While most of us can barely make toast when half asleep, Kenny pulled off a full-fledged road trip through traffic lights, turns, perhaps even past some Tim Hortons, all with his brain in the dreamlands. What happened next, dear listener, is both tragic and confounding. Once there, still allegedly asleep, Kenneth brutally attacked his mother-in-law, causing her death, and injured his father-in-law. He then seemingly awoke, covered in blood, and drove himself to the police station, distraught and confused. According to reports, he walked in and said, "I think I've killed some people. My hands." A chilling moment. And yet, the most fascinating part is what followed. His defense: he'd done it all while asleep, not metaphorically, literally sleepwalking. A state of automatism, a term that may sound like a poorly named IKEA lamp, but is actually a genuine and complex legal defense. Automatism implies that a person acted involuntarily, without conscious control, like someone hypnotized by the rhythm of a particularly boring lecture. The court was understandably skeptical, but after an extensive review, medical examinations, and testimony from neurologists and sleep experts, Kenneth was found not guilty of murder. The jury believed he had been sleepwalking at the time of the attack. Despite the horror of it all, the ruling became a landmark decision in the use of non-insane automatism in Canadian law. Now, a little soft sidebar here. Let's not all go pointing fingers and saying, "Well, I kicked the microwave while asleep. Guess I'm excused from jury duty and taxes." No, sleepwalking defenses are incredibly rare, and courts approach them with the caution of a cat inspecting a cucumber. You might say they demand more evidence than a toddler demanding extra bedtime stories, and rightly so. Still, this curious case opened the door to wider discussions about consciousness, culpability, and how our brains sometimes go off script in the most alarming ways. So if tonight you find yourself rising from bed in the small hours, maybe double check where you're heading. If it's the kitchen, carry on. If you're halfway to Scarborough, perhaps consult a somnologist. In Chapter 3, we'll slip even further back in time, to another baffling tale. One that involves a nightgown, a fireplace poker, and a Victorian murder trial that had the British tabloids of the day murmuring over their tea. But for now, allow your thoughts to drift like Kenneth's midnight drive into the misty quiet of your own sleepy subconscious. Let's adjust our slippers, tuck ourselves in, and float into another curious tale from the dusty cabinet of legal history's stranger shelves. You're listening to Boring History for Sleep, and tonight's chapter is a particularly woolly one. Picture England, 1846. There's fog curling like polite snakes around the lamplights, horses clop-clopping past cobbled alleys, constables hum lullabies while patrolling sleepy neighbourhoods that absolutely reek of overcooked cabbage and mild political unrest. And in the small market town of Burslem, Staffordshire, known mostly for pottery and dusk-like drizzle, lives a man by the name of Albert Tyrrell. But Albert, you see, has found himself in an international puddle of peculiarities, starting with a murder in Boston and ending in a courtroom where he confessed absolutely nothing, except to walking in his sleep. But forgive me, I'm getting ahead of myself. The name you really want to remember tonight is Rex v. Parks. This was the first ever English case to put the sleepwalking defense on elegant display in court. And no, this wasn't some cheeky schoolboy caught with marmalade in his slippers. This was quite serious. Thomas William Parks had strangled a man, nay, his father-in-law, and claimed with all the dazed sincerity of a man recently awakened from a nap that he'd done it while dreaming. In 1846, now for full nightcap clarity, let us reintroduce Parks. Parks was 24, Canadian, a shoe merchant. You see, when he wasn't curled up in his mother's guest room for an impolite nap, Parks had a troubling relationship with his in-laws, including the aforementioned victim, one Mr. Kinnear. On the night in question, Parks drove 14 miles, barefoot mind you, entered the home silently, bludgeoned Mr. Kinnear, and left without stealing so much as a butter knife. When Parks turned himself in, bleary-eyed, confused, and missing large swaths of memory, nobody quite knew what to do. A man murders his father-in-law in his sleep. Preposterous. And yet, oddly British in its abstract make-do attitude. Scientists of the day scratched their sideburns thoughtfully. Some declared it nonsense. Others, particularly Dr. George Mackenzie, a man who alleged he'd once boiled tea while asleep, insisted somnambulism was mysterious indeed, but not inherently violent. The defense called sleep behavior experts, and this is the 1840s mind. You know, back when sleep medicine involved smelling salts and maybe one quiet badger. But to their credit, the jury listened as doctors explained how a human could perform complex actions, from walking to dressing to unintentionally committing deeply unfortunate felonies, all while being, in the strictest sense, not completely awake. In a soft gavel thump heard round the world of criminal justice, Thomas Parks was acquitted, found not guilty, not insane, just profoundly unconscious. And this opened the squeaky door to a fascinating new kind of legal drama. Crimes of the inadvertent variety. Crimes with no motive but a misplaced pillow. And that's when the world began to wonder, if you can kill in your sleep, could you also do taxes, apologize to your ex, take a chicken out of the fridge, place it under a pillow, and insist later it was a dream? Sleepwalking, it seems, makes for wonderfully confusing alibis. Of course, many weren't convinced. Critics grumbled that Parks had simply found a clever loophole. How convenient, they said, twiddling their mustaches, but no one could ever definitively prove intent, or wakefulness, or anything that breached the thick pea soup fog of sleep behavior science. So there it stayed in history's little dozing sidebar, Rex vs. Parks, first of many to walk the tightrope between the dream world and legal culpability, a domino gently nudged into motion by a barefoot napper with a very unfortunate agenda. Speaking of footsteps in the night, in Chapter 4, we'll travel west across the ocean, where America was in the middle of manifestly destinying itself into trouble, and a dentist's son from Massachusetts took his own moonlit misstep into the history books. But we'll get there in time. For now, let the case of Thomas Parks tuck itself into the corner of your mind like a slightly troubling bedtime story, the one that insists ever so softly. Sometimes the real mystery isn't what we do while awake, but what we dream when no one's watching. It is the mid-19th century, and society has quite a few curious preoccupations. Gaslighting, not the emotional kind, though there was plenty of that too, horse-drawn everything, and a rising obsession with the workings of the human mind. You see, this was an age when science and superstition shared the same uncomfortable Victorian parlour. People were beginning to define the brain with strange new words like neurology and psyche, but also still very much believed their phrenologist when he said their lumps indicated a criminal personality. It was also, quite fittingly, the era that bore witness to some of the most curious sleepwalking murder defenses the courts had yet seen, or expected. If Chapter 3 showed us the disturbing stirrings of somnambulism as a legal plea, Chapter 4 takes us into the drawing rooms and dusty courtrooms of those who tried to walk the tightrope between madness, science, and mens rea, which is just fancy Latin for guilty mind. Because nothing puts people to sleep faster than Latin. You're welcome. Let's turn the gas lamps low and visit Bath, England's most elegant former Roman spa town, and the site of the curious 1846 case of Albert Tyrrell. Now, Tyrrell was not from Bath, but Boston, the city with lobster rolls and a strong desire to mispronounce the letter R. He was a married man, which usually wouldn't be headline material, except that he had a mistress, the upstanding and unfortunately doomed Maria Bickford, who was found murdered in her bed, throat slit with a razor, and, bafflingly, with her bed set on fire around her. Gruesome, I know, but don't worry, we won't linger on the crime scene, just the part where things got legally cozy. You see, despite the blood, the flames, and the fleeing, Tyrrell's lawyer built a defense that turned the era's curiosity about sleepwalking into courtroom theatre. He claimed that Tyrrell had killed Maria entirely in his sleep, like brushing your teeth, or dreaming you missed your exams, or climbing onto the roof to duel with a pigeon. You know, sleep stuff. The idea was more plausible than it sounds. By this time, experts were emerging, albeit with enormous mutton chops and questionable diplomas, who had begun studying sleepwalking, and they concluded that it could cause people to perform incredibly complex actions, climbing buildings, solving math, slicing bread, perhaps even, dare we imagine, committing a crime. Tyrrell's attorney, one Rufus Choate, if a name ever sounded like it belonged in an old-timey pickle commercial, it is that, turned the trial into a lesson on sleep disorders. Choate said that Albert had no motive, had a history of somnambulism, and that sleepwalkers could move fluidly while entirely unconscious. He painted somnambulists not as threats, but as tragic ghosts of wakefulness. One juror apparently nodded off mid-explanation, which seems thematically appropriate. Against the odds, it worked. Tyrrell was acquitted, and the newspapers printed astonished headlines about the sleepwalking murderer. Some were aghast, others impressed, but mostly the public was confused, delighted by the novelty, and possibly a little nervous about what their own relatives were doing while in their nightly stupor. The Tyrrell case didn't prove sleepwalking as a solid legal defense. It remained rare and often distrusted, but it showed that juries could be swayed by explanations that dipped a toe in neuroscience and a foot in soft science fiction. The defense had to be captivating, educational, and dramatic enough to distract from the fire damage. It was a time before brain scans or sleep labs, so the people had to rely on their gut and their noses, both of which sometimes led them astray. In Tyrrell's case, it led him to freedom, though reportedly, he fled to Canada and wasn't heard from much after, which, for someone who may or may not sleep murder, is probably for the best. And so, dear listener, as we tuck away the transcript of Tyrrell vs. reality and let the legal candle flicker low, we find ourselves wondering, where precisely does intention end and the mind's midnight meanderings begin? Let's keep drifting. In Chapter 5, we'll cross the ocean, again, and meet a man whose slumber sent shockwaves across the Canadian court system. Pull your blanket close. It involves chopped firewood, a startling walk through the snow, and of course, another courtroom daring to decipher the dreams of the unknowingly violent. The year was 1846. Horses clip-clopped over cobblestone streets, trousers were extremely high-waisted, and Boston smelled faintly of molasses, slightly more faintly of unwashed socks. It was in this bustling, bee-whiskered city that a certain gentleman named Albert Tyrrell decided to take a leisurely nap, or so he later claimed. Now, Albert wasn't your average candle maker or carriage polisher. He was, let's say, a bit of a mischief enthusiast. A married man by title, Albert actually spent most of his time frequenting the company of one Maria Bickford, a woman of companionable sophistication. She worked in what we'd now call the hospitality industry, though with slightly fewer pillow mints and a bit more pearl-handled razzle-dazzle. The two had a complicated relationship, equal parts romance, obsession, and Victorian-era melodrama. Neighbours whispered, fingers pointed. Albert, it seemed, wasn't exactly the solid type to bring home to mother. And then, on a crisp September morning, Maria Bickford was found dead in her boarding house bed. Her throat had been gruesomely slashed, almost surgically. A candle had been upturned, sparking a modest fire. Her possessions were strewn, her bed soaked. The room dripped with melodrama, and unfortunately, with blood. And Albert, he had vanished. Not exactly the kind of behavior you'd expect from an innocent man, unless, of course, one was sleepwalking. After weeks as a fugitive, during which time he grew a beard that was described oddly as mossy, Albert was caught hiding in New Orleans, which, as everyone knows, is the most confusing place to flee if you don't want to be found dancing to trumpet music with powdered sugar on your shirt. Albert Tyrrell faced the death penalty, and his guilt seemed irrefutable. There he was, the only person with motive, opportunity, and a history of poor impulse control. But then came the twist. Enter one Rufus Choate. Yes, that's really his name. And no, he was not a 19th century breakfast cereal mascot, but a Harvard-educated, rumple-suited legal mind with the flair of a Shakespearean actor and the eyebrows of an exasperated falcon. Choate chose a defense strategy that left the courtroom blinking in unison: sleepwalking. According to Choate, it was entirely plausible that Tyrrell murdered Maria in a state of somnambulistic delusion. He knew not what he'd done. A walking dream he was. A man driven not by malice, but by mysterious forces of his unconscious mind. He even cited cases of people cooking omelettes, crawling across rooftops and, yes, even committing acts of violence, all while utterly asleep. The jury was understandably baffled. On one hand, the defense sounded borderline whimsical, like something lifted from a Gothic novella. On the other, could they really prove it wasn't true? After deliberating for 2 days, probably while drinking boots full of coffee and debating whether somnambulism sounded more like sleepwalking or a rare skin condition, they made their decision. Not guilty. Yes. Albert Tyrrell became the first person in American history to be acquitted of murder using the sleepwalking defense. He walked straight out of that courtroom, still very much awake, and lived out the rest of his life in relative quiet. No more blood-soaked beds or melodramatic midnight alibis. The case sent chatter through courtrooms and coffee houses alike. Could sleepwalking really be a get-out-of-jail-free card? Was Albert truly unconscious, or just remarkably shameless and lucky? Well, the jury may be long dead, but the question still tosses and turns to this very day. And as we snug deeper under our own blankets tonight, let us leave Mr. Tyrrell's curious fate tucked neatly into the folds of judicial oddities. He may have walked into history like a man in a trance, but his case lit the lantern for future legal sleepwalkers to wander through. Now, curious minds, what happened when science stepped into the courtroom? When the brain's inner workings became not just evidence, but alibi? In Chapter 6, we'll gently pull back the curtain on the snoozy science of brainwaves, midnight outbursts, and the remarkable people who've punched their way into legal textbooks, all before sunrise. But for now, close your eyes. Let Rufus Choate's dramatic eyebrows retreat into the shadows. Let Boston's cobblestones fall silent and sink just a little deeper into sleep. Let's set the scene. The year is 1987. The location, Ontario, Canada. A land where maple syrup flows like sleepy dreams, and the most aggressive form of social unrest is someone skipping the Tim Hortons drive-through line. Our subject tonight is Kenneth Parkes. At the age of 23, Kenneth was your average suburban Canadian. He had a job, a wife, a baby daughter, and, as it turns out, a sleep disorder that no one, not even he, took seriously until it led to something so unthinkable, so strangely medical legal, that it still rattles the sleepwalking discourse today. Now, let's start gently with Kenneth's lifestyle. By day, he worked at an electric utility company, a job as thrilling as a bag of unbuttered popcorn. But at night, Kenneth had a problem. Parasomnia. That's the polite medical term for all the nighttime nonsense your brain can conjure. Sleepwalking, for instance, which Kenneth did regularly. His wife noted he would wander around the house snoozing, unknowingly piloting his body like a confused Roomba on the fritz. But don't worry, we're still in soft mystery territory here. Now, let's follow Kenneth into the events of one fateful night in May of 1987. Earlier that evening, he dozed off in front of the television. A normal Canadian evening. Some hockey, some laughter, and then darkness. But instead of staying on his couch, Kenneth rose. He drove, yes, drove, some 14 miles to the home of his in-laws. He claims no memory of this, which is frankly chilling, but also quite astonishing, because he made it there safely, meaning our boy Kenneth was navigating Canadian roads completely asleep. Imagine sleep parallel parking. I can barely do that fully awake. Upon arriving, Kenneth entered the house and, in what psychologists would later describe as a violent sleep episode, attacked his in-laws, His mother-in-law was killed. His father-in-law was seriously injured but survived. The details of the assault are troubling, but in the spirit of keeping things dreamily digestible, we'll sip over those and instead float gently over what happened next. Here's where it gets strange again. Kenneth drove himself to the police station. Bleeding from self-inflicted wounds and visibly distraught, he shuffled into the station lobby and confessed, saying something chillingly simple. "I think I've killed someone." But he was confused, dazed, and had no idea how or why it had happened. Cue the courtroom, where silence and confusion reign supreme. Enter the sleepwalking defense. Kenneth's legal team argued that he had no conscious control over his actions. They brought in experts in sleep disorders who testified that Kenneth was in a state of non-insane automatism, which, despite sounding like a fancy robot melodrama, is actually a rare legal category used when someone commits a crime during an automatic mental state, like sleep. It was, as you might gently predict, a legal roller coaster, one that moved the bar forward in sleepwalking defenses, though very, very slowly, so no one caused a ruckus. In 1988, the jury found Kenneth not guilty. That's right, the court agreed he had acted involuntarily. The verdict shocked many, but the reasoning was clear. If a person acts without intent, without awareness, how can they be held criminally responsible? It set a precedent, one both lauded and scrutinized, that would be discussed in many late-night legal debates, ideally with warm cocoa. Now, this chapter of Kenneth's life, like sleepwalking itself, is full of murky pathos, soft horror, and deep questions about consciousness. But in the hushed corridors of history, it's a whispery example of how thin the veil can be between dreams and deeds, and whether we are always the author of our stories while we sleep. Next time, we'll twist quietly through Victorian London as we examine why sleepless nights in gaslit streets led to moral panics and a surprising number of people blamed for crimes they probably didn't commit. So for now, fluff that pillow, breathe slowly, and keep an eye on the butter knives. Chapter 7 awaits. Shh, lean back, rest your ears, and allow the droning hum of an old-timey British regional court to lull you into a deeper calm. This is Chapter 7 of our cozy little dive into the sleepy, eerie world of sleepwalking murders. And tonight, we drift gently into the fog-swirled streets of 19th century Newcastle, England, a town industrial enough to smell perpetually of coal dust and Victorian ambition. Now, before you get too excited, remember this is boring history for sleep. No high drama, just one mildly shocking episode buffered by legal quirks and the slow shuffle of barristers in woolen wigs. That's the good stuff, right? Tonight's nap-worthy mystery features William Wordsworth, no relation to the famous poet. Or if he was, the poet never mentioned him. And frankly, who could blame him? William was an ironmonger by trade, a husband by circumstance, and a somnambulist by quirky design. His case, tried in 1871, forever left an oily little fingerprint on the dusty files of British criminal law, and on our sleepy imaginations. Now, William was known to wander on occasion, mostly harmless episodes in which he'd startle house guests by sleep-cooking boiled eggs at 2 a.m, or waking his wife by reciting shipping schedules for goods he hadn't ordered. But then came the rainy Monday, when things turned dark. According to testimony, William had retired early that night, after soufflé and a small amount of gin, standard protocol for Victorian evenings. His wife, Beatrice, had gone to bed shortly after, noting nothing unusual apart from William hoarding an alarming number of throw pillows, which may, or may not, have contributed to the entire unfortunate chain of events. At approximately 3:12 in the morning, a time when one should naturally only be dreaming of teacups or quietly judging rusty hinges, William was found on their back stoop, weeping softly, holding a garden spade. Beatrice, unfortunately, lay inside with a bruise on her temple and a bump to the head that might have just come from fateful nocturnal clumsiness. Or, well, maybe not. The gaslight stayed dim on that mystery. The real twist: William had no memory of any of it. None. Not the spade, not the sobbing, not even the pillow hoarding. He'd woken there confused, his nightshirt smeared with mud and guilt. When he went on trial, it turned into a spectacle. Local townsfolk filed in under misty skies, dressed in their Sunday glummest, and amid the sighing of wooden benches and gavel taps from a judge who probably hadn't had a thrilling morning in 20 years, the defense put forth a novel idea: sleepwalking. Yes, William wasn't a murderer. He was merely a long-limbed victim of his own subconscious misfire. According to his doctors, and there were at least 3, all with delightfully old-timey sideburns, he often entered a state of vigorous somnambulism, which, translated into comforting historical jargon, just means he did very weird stuff while asleep. The argument was daring, even yawningly bold. They contended that the blow to poor Beatrice had been an accident of environment, like an umbrella knocking over a lamp, a terrible, tragic misstep in the choreography of REM sleep gone rogue. What's more, they argued he had been dreaming that someone had broken into the house. His brain, operating somewhere between fog and instinct, had attempted to defend his home using whatever came to hand. In this case, a gardening tool he had no business being near in that hour or outfit. The result? Acquitted. Shocking at the time. And even now, if you're not already nodding gently to sleep, this might seem a terribly peculiar outcome. But William's case added another sleepy knot to the ball of legal string that is the sleepwalking defense. He returned to life, not entirely unscarred, as Beatrice never quite forgave being attacked during her slumber by a man who couldn't even apologize properly because he had no memory of the event. Nonetheless, he lived out his days peacefully, famously adding a bell to the bedroom doorknob and never again consuming souffle after dusk. And with William's court case fading softly into the coal-scented Northumberland air, we leave Newcastle behind, slowly panning eastward. In Chapter 8, we peek into a very different courtroom in a land of DNA, digital clocks, and cable news headlines. A modern sleepwalking case with echoes of the past. Stay tucked in. We'll drift there shortly. Picture it. A fog-laced London street, the kind that muffles footsteps and makes lanterns glow like golden ghosts. The year is somewhere in the gentle rustle of 1870-something. Queen Victoria is perched stoically on the throne. Corsets are cinched, moustaches are waxed, and the streets smell, let's not sugarcoat it, decidedly horsey. Tucked behind lace curtains and heavy velvet drapes, inside dimly lit parlours where the gaslights flicker and everyone's a little bit worried about spontaneous combustion, the Victorian world snuck further into the mystery of sleep. Sleepwalking, or noctambulation, as earnest 19th century gentlemen insisted on calling it, to sound terribly scientific, was beginning to trickle into the parlance of criminal courts. In this era of top hats and chloroform, one particular case drifted out of the smog and into legal textbooks. Let us introduce Mr. Albert Tyrrell. Now, by this chapter, you may recall Albert from a previous nocturnal misadventure. We'll refresh your memory in a moment. What sets Victorian sleepwalking cases apart isn't just the mustaches or vaguely haunted wallpaper. It's how absolutely convinced people were that mysterious forces were forever sweeping through the drawing room, rearranging furniture, spooning jam into inappropriate jars, and occasionally committing murder. Albert Tyrrell, still the poster child for 19th century "oops, I did it in my sleep" defense, had, decades earlier in 1846, been accused of murdering Maria Bickford in Boston. But the reverberations of his scandalous acquittal carried on like a harpsichord echo in a damp manor house, inspiring legal minds across the English-speaking world to consider the absurd. What if an otherwise upstanding man, albeit one who frequenteth brothels, could kill while utterly unconscious? Fast forward now, in Victorian tempo, to several lesser-known cases in both Britain and colonial lands like Canada and Australia, though the names are often lost to dusty archives or published in the smallest of footnotes, which, let's be honest, is where history often keeps its best secrets. Each case followed a heartbeat familiar rhythm. Nighttime lapse, violent act, courtroom confusion. Most of these sleepwalking tales, tucked inside the pages of broadsheets and tucked in between earnest horse auctions and public notices about runaway geese, shared common features. The accused was said to have suffered from long-standing episodes of sleep trouble. Strange behavior was reportedly observed during childhood, and many had been known to walk about the house at odd hours, murmuring gibberish or attempting to light non-existent fires. One subtle Victorian gem comes from the diaries of a London physician who treated a young painter, nameless of course, because discretion is the better part of boring history. This particular gentleman attempted to climb into his landlady's soup pot in the middle of the night, insisting he was fighting off Napoleon. Naturally, no charges were pressed, but he did face eviction and an eyebrow-raising entry in the local newsletter. But where comedy ends, courts begin. As the 1870s turned into the 1880s, prosecutors, judges, and somnolent defense attorneys began to wrestle with a slippery legal question, dipped fully in candle wax and Victorian florals. Could a man, or heaven forbid a gentlewoman, be held responsible for deeds done without knowledge in a state of disordered sleep? To our modern minds, comfortably nestled in memory foam and high thread count sheets, it may seem odd that such a question ever puzzled the greatest minds of the age. But in their world, where humours were still occasionally mentioned in not entirely joking tones, and where dreams were believed capable of sneaking you into sin, the line between choice and compulsion was softer than Yorkshire pudding, and no law was in complete agreement. In fact, one British judge declared that while the law did not punish someone for crimes committed in their sleep, it also had no proper method to prove that one was, indeed, sleepwalking, and not simply pretending to avoid a rather dreary stay at Newgate Prison. This ambiguity made sleepwalking cases rare but riveting. People read about them with the same guilty captivation as gas lamp murder mysteries or serializations of Dracula, who, incidentally, did quite a bit of swooping around in the night without full consent of the conscious. And yet, even as accepting sleepwalking as a potential defense became medically fashionable, like leeches once were, the courts proceeded with caution. They wanted science, not spooks, facts, not fog. Still, the drama of the midnight murder lingered in the public imagination, where it would continue to evolve. And as we extinguish the gaslights for tonight and tuck ourselves back beneath woven quilts and quiet thoughts, we'll journey next into the curious terrain of dreams, where the lawless mind may wander and where Chapter 9 awaits, softly stepping into the world of theories and the unconscious mind. The world in 1846 was a swirling cloud of top hats, horse-drawn omnibuses, and an unusually high consumption of molasses per capita. In Boston, Massachusetts, amidst cobblestone streets and the slightly puritanical leftover breeze from its colonial days, a truly macabre event swept into court gossip like a particularly alarming gust of wind. So fluff up your pillow, let your ears do the sauntering, and let's gently meander into the curious trial of a man named Albert Tyrrell. Now, before we dive into the sleepwalking part, and don't worry, it's coming, first allow yourself to picture Tyrrell, a handsome, wealthy gentleman, of the sort who probably adjusted his cravat with suspicious frequency. He was married, yes, but also notoriously entangled in a romantic relationship with a woman named Maria Bickford, a popular and professionally affectionate resident of a Boston brothel. It wasn't exactly the sort of relationship you wordlessly discuss over afternoon tea with Aunt Prudence. The plot, as you might guess, thickens quite like overboiled oatmeal. In October of that year, Maria Bickford was found in her boarding house, her throat brutally slashed, and a fire, how dramatic, had been set in an apparent attempt to cover the tracks. And just coincidentally, Tyrrell had fled the scene. Now, guilty behavior is not always proof of guilt, but it's never what you'd call excellent form. So here we have our well-dressed suspect, a man about town caught in a whirling scandal, and yet it gets odder. Tyrrell did not deny being at the scene. Instead, when he was eventually caught and brought to trial, his defense voluntarily tiptoed into the realm of somnambulism. Yes, dear listener, sleepwalking. The lawyer, a clever fellow named Rufus Choate, posited something rather theatrical for the time, that Tyrrell murdered Maria unintentionally, perhaps while under the influence of grief, passion, and a dreadful night's sleep. He allegedly stood up in a nocturnal stupor and committed the act while utterly unconscious, pillow logic in motion. Now, one might imagine the jury responded to this excuse somewhere between snorts of disbelief and embarrassed silence. But Rufus Choate, who was as loquacious as his sideburns were majestic, put forth what ended up being one of the first significant uses of the sleepwalking defense in American legal history. He argued eloquently, if not a little breathlessly, that sleepwalkers could reenact complex tasks with all the coordination of a rehearsed performance, all while asleep. Certainly, not unlike attempting to brush one's teeth while still dreaming about missed homework deadlines. Choate brought up medical testimony, character witnesses, and perhaps a few metaphors too many. One doctor likened sleepwalking to an orchestra playing without a conductor, which I suppose would explain a crime of passion composed in such horrific haste. And, perhaps most fascinating of all, it worked. Yes, in a moment that undoubtedly left Boston society reaching for its smelling salts, the jury found Albert Tyrrell not guilty. Through a haze of disbelief, ink-stained newspapers clutched their figurative pearls. The defense had suggested one of the darkest crimes imaginable could be committed by a man in nightclothes, entirely unaware. It was a verdict that rattled legal precedent. While never quite opening the floodgates for slumbering scoundrels to escape courtrooms whistling lullabies, it did ignite interest in the sleep defense, a curious fusion of medicine, morality, and midnight foolishness. Of course, this case did not suggest that all unconscious behavior gets a free pass, and later courts would be a bit more skeptical. But Tyrrell's trial remains a curious window into just how little we once understood consciousness, and just how persuasive a good lawyer can be when wrapped in eloquence and a faint air of mysticism. So, What happened to Mr. Tyrrell after his dramatic absolution? Well, conveniently, he left Boston and lived out the rest of his days rather quietly, which is just about what anyone should do after being acquitted of murder by reason of maybe being asleep. Now, as your breathing slows and the night draws its curtain slightly lower, we turn toward another figure, one whose story takes place across the Atlantic and whose midnight wanderings proved even more sharply contested. Let's drift onward toward Chapter 10, where a man named Jules will take center stage, slumberland included. Let's float gently now, dear listener, away from the brooding courtrooms of earlier decades and across the quiet border into the maple-scented landscapes of Canada, specifically into the sleepy suburban sprawl of Toronto circa 1987. A year when VHS rentals were at their peak, perms defied gravity, and television sets still politely waited for viewers to arrive, not the other way around. But beneath the genteel humdrum of this era, something unthinkable stirred. Our story begins, as many good tales do, with a barbecue. Yes, dear listener, a classic Canadian cue for checkered shirts, awkward small talk, and too many potato salads. Ken Parks, a 23-year-old man with a soft face and a love of television trivia, was invited to dinner by his in-laws. A seemingly ordinary plan. What made Ken stand out wasn't anything dramatic. He was not notorious. In fact, he embodied the kind of bland reliability that put the boring in boring history, in the most comforting way. He was a young, married father, holding down a job at a car dealership, playing squash during his lunch breaks, and juggling the usual buffet of financial missteps. Gambling debts had quietly squeezed him into a sweaty corner, and in a noble, if slightly doomed, attempt at redemption, Ken had confessed his situation to his wife just days earlier. He promised to make it right. Then came a strange and almost poetic night in May. Just before bedtime, Ken fell asleep in his home, and while all seemed quiet, somewhere in the shadows of his mind, unconscious intention stirred. What happened next was a sequence of actions so incredible, so chilling, and yet so curiously, narratively organized that it would soon be dissected by scientists, lawyers, journalists, and midnight YouTubers around the world. Ken rose from his slumber, got into his car, and drove 14 miles to his in-laws' home. That is, while still asleep. His arrival was anything but peaceful. He attacked his mother-in-law, Barbara, fatally, and severely injured his father-in-law. And then, perhaps most confoundingly, he drove himself to the police station and confessed in what witnesses described as a trance-like state. His hands were bloodied, but his words were fragmented. He said gently and without panic, "I think I've killed some people. My hands." Now, let's pause and let this bizarre tableau hover slightly above us, like a surrealist painting in a Victorian parlour. Because here's where the story drifts into the foggy waters of legal and neurological debate. Ken was charged with murder, but the defense proposed something rare and radical, that he had acted in a state of automatism brought on by sleepwalking. They brought in an army of sleep specialists who monitored Ken in overnight sleep labs, maps of his brain painted in softly blinking lights. And guess what? The data showed that Ken did indeed suffer from unusually deep disordered sleep patterns. The experts drew attention to his parasomnia, a bundle term for odd nocturnal behaviors that could, apparently, include quite a violent travel itinerary. So the courtroom transformed into a strange theatre of modern science and ancient questions. Is a man responsible for actions his conscious brain never orchestrated? Is sleep a kind of sovereign republic, immune to legal declarations. In 1988, the jury decided Ken Parks was acquitted. His sleepwalking defense succeeded. The reaction rippled outward like gentle rain over still water. Citizens furrowed their brows, judges sipped contemplative tea, and philosophers re-entered those deliciously murky realms of moral responsibility. Could a dreamer truly be guilty? And while public sentiment swayed like an overtired pendulum, the case itself became a landmark. It was one of the first modern instances where the sleepwalking defense not only entered a courtroom, but emerged victorious. Ken's story, however, does not end inside those panelled walls. In fact, as we drift deeper into the darker corners of this defense, we'll see that the legal world is not done sleepwalking just yet. So fluff your pillow and let your thoughts ripple like velvet curtains in a soft breeze. Because in Chapter 11, we'll wander into even stranger territory, where the lines between sleeping, waking, and responsibility blur into shadows. In the cloudy depths of the 19th century, long before we had smartwatches to monitor our sleep cycles or crime scene podcasts to overanalyze our dreams, nestled in rural France, a peculiar case tiptoed its way into legal history, not with a bang, but a murmuring hush of mystery, an alleged midnight poison. Ah, yes, dear listener, lean back a little further into your pillow. Let the tension seep out of your temples. Stretch your toes if they're not already cocooned in blanket. Tonight, we slip into the less than familiar tale of one Mary Voisin. Once a housekeeper, always a curious question mark in the architecture of sleepwalking defense. Now, Mary wasn't the kind of woman who drew attention in daylight. By all accounts, she was modest, obedient, and particularly skilled at making soup. But one dark November evening in 1875, the soup did not soothe, it condemned. The story begins with a pot of bouillon. Her employer, Madame Carnot, no relation to the future French president, but equally fond of lace slippers, had been feeling unwell. Mary, intent on helping, decided to prepare an aromatic broth peppered with the herbs of healing, or so she claimed. However, Madame Carnot did not find it comforting. In fact, her final words, right before crumpling into her overstuffed parlour chair, were, according to the village gossips, "This soup tastes like malicious daisies." Daisies, while innocent in appearance, were not typically included in French cooking, malicious or otherwise. A hurried examination revealed something far more mischievous. Belladonna, also known as deadly nightshade, which is not, as it turns out, something one adds for flavour. A substance almost comically lethal, if not for the glaring medical emergency at hand. Poor Mary was swiftly brought before the magistrate. Her defence? She had no recollection of making the soup. "I must have been asleep," she insisted, wringing her apron as though it might leak out an explanation. She claimed to be a habitual sleepwalker, that she often wandered in the night, rearranged the silverware, and once milked a stranger's goat at 2 a.m. Such things, she explained, rarely made it into consciousness. Now, one must give the 19th century French court some credit here. Sleepwalking, known in the writings of sleep scholars by the impressively drowsy name somnambulism, had gained a rather fashionable scientific following. Philosophers, physicians, and a man named Dr. Jean-Baptiste Bouillon all chimed in with theories ranging from disrupted humours to moon-triggered madness. While they lacked modern EEGs and sleep labs, they were nonetheless fascinated by the idea that a person could rise in the dead of night and do, well, nearly anything, all without forming a memory. Sleepwalking, in this sense, became the dream state cousin of temporary insanity. But poison? Even the gentle Dr. Bouillon, usually generous in his support of unusual sleep behavior, hesitated to endorse late-night pharmacology. The issue before the court was delicate. Could Mary Voisin, in the fogginess of sleep, misidentify belladonna for basil? Did she, amidst a sleep-induced desire to heal, brew up a fatal herbal medley? The court, with a sigh that historians believe sounded distinctly like resignation, did not buy it. Unlike previous somnambulistic defenses, Mary had no prior record of violent behavior while asleep, just nail clipping and involuntary goat lactation. The expert physician concluded, in phrasing both precise and deeply unhelpful, that while somnambulism can occasion curious acts, poisoning requires precise measurement and intent, both somewhat difficult to achieve when one is drooling mid-dream. In other words, it seemed unlikely that Mary, even in her most motivated moonlit state, had remembered to measure out the fatal dosage. Mary was convicted, not for sleepwalking, but for manslaughter, based largely on the theory that she had reached for the wrong herb during her nighttime kitchen adventures. And thus, this odd little footnote of French legal history gently reminds us: sleepwalking may explain why your socks are in the fridge, or why your neighbor swears you knocked on her door wearing only a monocle. But it rarely holds up when poison is involved. Now, as you rest your head and let your mind drift like an old wooden rowboat on the sleepy river of thought, prepare to join me in Chapter 12, where we skip across the channel to Victorian England, with another curious case of nocturnal behavior and a house guest who simply never woke up. Now picture this. It's the year 1846 in Boston, a city brimming with cobblestones, horse-drawn carriages, and slightly too much fog for comfort. The kind of setting where you'd expect a moody detective to emerge from an alley with a magnifying glass and a monologue. But instead, up steps Albert Tyrrell, a man whose name sounds more like a Victorian accountant than a defendant in one of America's earliest and oddest murder trials. Albert Tyrrell was, by most accounts, a gentleman with, shall we say, morally flexible hobbies. He'd been romantically entangled with a woman named Maria Bickford, a well-known sex worker with a strong will and a fondness for fine things. Their relationship was fiery, which is a poetic way of saying they argued a lot. The kind of explosive back and forth that would be deeply concerning even by modern reality TV standards. Then came the morning in question. On October 27th, 1845, Maria Bickford was found in her Boston boarding house room, dead, her throat brutally slashed, and her bed set ablaze in what appeared to be an attempt to cover up the crime. It didn't take long for suspicion to point toward good old Albert Tyrrell. After all, he had reportedly been seen with her in the hours prior, and then, mysteriously, he vanished, which, in a murder investigation, is rarely a helpful move. Now, one might think that fleeing the city after your ex-partner is found murdered would land you squarely in Troubletown. Population, you. And indeed, when Albert was arrested in New Orleans some weeks later, things weren't looking great for him. But this wasn't just any tale of crime and consequences. Oh no, this was a tale about sleepwalking. Yes, that's right. During the trial, Tyrrell's defense attorney, the spectacularly named Rufus Choate, a man whose hair, charisma, and vocabulary all seemed to have their own primary residence, presented a novel and audacious defense. He argued that Tyrrell had committed the murder while sleepwalking. Now, this was no light claim. Sleepwalking, or somnambulism, if you're feeling particularly well-read, was poorly understood at the time. But Choate leaned into it, with courtroom flair that would make any modern lawyer blush. He painted a picture of a tormented man, so racked with sleep disorders and emotional torment that his subconscious had taken the wheel, driving him to commit a horrific act of violence without any awareness. One moment, Tyrrell was a pensive dreamer in his slumber. Blink, and he's allegedly slicing throats in a fugue of unconscious sorrow. It was the kind of defense that normally might have earned eye rolls from both judge and jury. But Rufus Choate was nothing if not convincing. He cited medical experts, spun philosophical arguments about free will, and even peppered in instances of Tyrrell's reportedly odd nocturnal behaviours. The jury, likely as spellbound by Choate's drama as they were confused by the newfangled psychology, took just 2 hours to acquit Albert Tyrrell. That's right, found not guilty, on the grounds that he may have been asleep at the murderous wheel. It stands as possibly the first use of the sleepwalking defense in an American courtroom, and it opened a crinkly, soot-stained door to a legal concept that would be used again and again in curious trials throughout the decades. Now, one might raise an eyebrow at this verdict. Even in the drowsiest state, setting fire to a bed tends to involve a few too many steps for a somnambulant soul. But therein lies the charm and peculiarity of legal history. Sometimes, the oddest ideas tip the scales, especially when served with a dollop of eloquence and a sprinkle of courtroom drama. And so, born on the wings of an acquittal and perhaps a few yawns of disbelief, Albert Tyrrell walked free. He faded into the quieter shadows of history, leaving baffled townsfolk, charred bedding, and a legal precedent that would echo softly through time. But was Tyrrell truly asleep? Or was his attorney just wide awake and wildly persuasive? Ah, the fog of mystery thickens. In Chapter 13, we'll gently wander over to another compelling case, one that involves sleep, a fatal misunderstanding, and a man claiming to have no memory of holding a weapon at all. Drift with me, won't you? Drift gently with me now to the late 20th century, a time of neon windbreakers, cassette tapes, and the growing popularity of outdoor recreation among people who had never actually slept outside. It's during this quietly earnest era we find ourselves in the lakeside calm of Ontario, Canada. More precisely, deep in the sleepy quietude of a provincial park, where the pine trees stand tall and the mosquitoes stage their nightly symphonies. Our spotlight, or perhaps a soft lantern's glow, now falls upon the curious case of Kenneth Parkes, a man whose life would tip unexpectedly into the annals of criminal history, all while, by his own account, being entirely asleep. Kenneth, much like your average worn-down 23-year-old in 1987, was having a rough go. He was suffering from insomnia, financial troubles, job stress, and the kind of creeping dread that tends to bloom in the soul when all of life's invoices arrive at once. But this chapter isn't about Kenneth's budget. It's about what he did, or perhaps undid, in a condition somewhere between slumber and subconscious chaos. On a late May evening, after drifting to bed, Kenneth reportedly slipped into a state of automaticity. In layman's terms, he got up in his sleep, but not just a classic kitchen fumble for the cookie jar. No, Kenneth drove. Yes, drove. 14 miles to the home of his in-laws, all while asleep. Now, dear listener, let's pause here. I invite you to ponder, gently and without concern, whether you could navigate your own driveway without yawning into a shrub. Now imagine parking, entering a house, and interacting with people on autopilot, a feat either of eerie efficiency or something far more disturbing. Once inside the home, a tragic scene unfolded. Kenneth's mother-in-law was fatally attacked, and his father-in-law sustained injuries, and all of it, Kenneth insisted, happened without his conscious awareness. After the incident, Kenneth drove directly to a police station. According to reports, he walked into the station in blood-stained clothes, held out his hands, and said something to the tune of, "I think I've killed some people," all while appearing dazed and disoriented, not quite waking from the fog of whatever terrors his brain had conjured. And now, our courtroom drama begins. The defense, armed with a cavalcade of sleep experts, EEG readings, and Kenneth's bizarre post-incident behavior, made their case that this was a genuine episode of somnambulism, real, deep sleepwalking, a nightmare in motion. His brain simply switched into gear and behaved as though the body were conscious, while consciousness itself was taking the night off. The prosecution, understandably, raised a skeptical brow. The idea that someone could perform such complex, coordinated actions, starting a car, driving, unlocking a door, wielding a weapon, all without waking, strained their belief. And truly, who could blame them? It reads more like an Edgar Allan Poe story set during a camping trip. But the jury, they believed Kenneth. In 1988, he was acquitted of both murder and attempted murder. His defense team had successfully convinced the court that this was not a premeditated crime, but a chillingly involuntary episode rooted in a known sleep disorder. The case of Kenneth Parks sits as one of the landmark examples of the sleepwalking defense, and perhaps the only one involving highway navigation and familial tragedy. For historians and legal scholars, it beckons heavy questions about accountability, about consciousness, and about just how much control we really have when sleep sets in. So, what did society learn? Surely not that sleepwalking grants one a free pass, but that the mind, in all its complexity, still hides corridors we barely understand. When dreams mimic wakefulness and muscles follow phantom instructions. Well, things get more complicated than a Sunday crossword. In the years that followed, the Parks case has continued to spawn legal debates, true crime documentaries, and at least one very dramatic reenactment involving actor recreations and an overuse of fog machines. As we let the courtroom dim and the gavel rest, our tale continues, because Kenneth Parks was not the only person to raise the veil on somnambulistic defense. But for now, let your mind go soft, and in our next chapter, we'll gently row into the even murkier waters of sleep science and the curious case of the gunslinger, who also happened to be napping. Curl in and drift on. By now, dear listener, you've found yourself comfortably sunk into the soft cushions of criminally cozy history. So fluff your pillow, loosen your metaphorical corset, and drift with me into another mysterious slumber-soaked case, this time featuring a courtroom, a nightgown, and a defendant who swore he didn't commit murder because, well, he was asleep. Let's tiptoe into the courthouse of 1997, deep in Toronto, Canada, where the case of Kenneth James Parks set an uneasy precedent and sent judicial eyebrows skyward. Now, Parks's sleepwalking saga technically begins in 1987, but it wasn't until a decade later that the implications tiptoed their way into the deeper folds of legal and scientific debate, earning this case a snug little blanket spot in legal history. By most accounts, Kenneth Parks was a typical Canadian man in his early 30s. Polite, hockey-loving, fond of maple syrup, the whole charming package. He held a steady job as a project coordinator, had a wife, a child, and, tragically, a terrible gambling addiction. His debts had snowballed into a frosty avalanche. By May of 1987, His financial troubles were a tangle of lies, shame, and mounting tension. Against this backdrop, something strange, eerily somnambulistic, happened one early Saturday morning. According to Parks, he went to bed that Friday night like any other evening. He snugged into his sheets, probably said goodnight to the moon, and drifted into sleep. The next thing he consciously remembers is being at a police station, hands sticky with blood, apparently having just confessed to murdering his mother-in-law and seriously injuring his father-in-law. But Parks claimed, and stick with me here, that he didn't remember doing any of it, that he had driven 14 miles to their home, broken in, attacked them both with a tire iron, then driven himself to the police station, all while asleep. It's the kind of defense that makes one wish the courtroom had armchairs and cocoa. Naturally, the justice system doesn't usually accept "I was asleep" as a reasonable alibi for blood-stained trousers. But as the investigation and sleep studies unfolded, the facts acquired a dreamy sort of ambiguity. There was no evidence of prior hostility. He loved his in-laws. He'd planned to tell them about his financial troubles that weekend, so no secrets kept. There was even security footage of him turning himself in, visibly confused and covered in blood. Parks underwent a battery of tests at a sleep disorder clinic. Doctors observed peculiar patterns suggesting, quite compellingly, abnormal parasomnia, specifically a type of complex sleepwalking behavior. In simple terms, his brain was sleeping, but his body was in Will-E coyote mode, all action and no forethought. The courtroom was hushed, save for the scratching of note-taking and the occasional rattle of someone remembering they'd forgotten to silence their pager. This was 1997, after all. The defense presented evidence so detailed and technical, it was essentially scientific lullaby material. Brainwave scans, EEG readings, clinical testimonies, it all built toward one sleepy conclusion. And astonishingly, the jury agreed. Kenneth Parks was acquitted, his sleepwalking defense successful. The Crown, Canada's prosecution, appealed, of course, as it's not every day someone walks into a dream and strolls out the other end with a clean criminal record. The Supreme Court of Canada ultimately upheld the original verdict, emphasizing that in rare cases, the mind can truly be offline while the body, quite alarmingly, is out for a stroll with harmful consequences. Dozing behind this decision lies one of the coziest little concepts in criminal law: automatism. Put simply, if you act without conscious control, like during a seizure, or yes, a particularly murderous case of sleepwalking, you might not bear legal responsibility. The trick is convincing 12 non-dozing humans of your unconsciousness. A heavy moral duvet settles on this story, because while science may allow us to understand the sleeping mind, the victims, Parks' in-laws, were real and lost something beyond repair. The trial cast a long shadow over Canadian legal and sleep medicine communities, raising complex questions about culpability, compassion, and neurobiology. So as you snuggle deeper into your own mattress haven tonight, rest easy knowing that your slumber likely won't land you in a courtroom. Just ensure your tire iron stays in the garage. Next, in Chapter 15, we travel back a few decades and across the pond to England, where an elegantly titled nobleman woke to a blood-stained bed and no memory whatsoever. Sleepwalking, yes, but with velvet slippers. Like all good bedtime stories, this one begins not with a scream, but with a snore. Welcome back to Boring History for Sleep, where no one is ever guilty of being too excited. In tonight's drowsy drift through legal oddities, we turn the sleepy spotlight to one of the most astonishing and baffling examples of the sleepwalking defense, and perhaps the most frequently discussed. It's the tale of Kenneth Parkes, a gentle Canadian man who paid a visit to his in-laws while entirely unconscious. Let's set the scene. It's the late 1980s in Ontario, Canada. Kenneth Parkes is a 23-year-old man with a loving wife, a steady job, and, unfortunately, a rather pesky gambling problem. A betting itch that had him spiraling into debt, dipping into the family savings, and even embezzling from his employer. All in all, insomnia-fueling stuff. His life and his sleep schedule were both in tatters. On the night of May 23, 1987, Kenneth fell asleep in his home. Up to this point, that's quite unremarkable. But later that night, or for the legally precise among you, at the uncanny hour of 4:30 a.m., he got up, drove 14 miles across suburban highways, walked into his in-laws' house with a car key, and, this is where things take a very non-drowsy turn, proceeded to stab his mother-in-law to death and seriously injure his father-in-law. Next thing anyone knows, Parkes has driven straight to a police station and turned himself in. His hands are covered in blood, his demeanor eerily calm. "I think I killed some people," he says, like he's just realized he left the tap running. He doesn't seem surprised. He doesn't seem aware. But here's the twist. He has no idea what he's done. Not in a metaphorical way. Literally, he can't remember the events. Doctors soon examine Parkes and conclude something utterly mind-boggling. He may have been sleepwalking during the entire episode. Now, this is usually the part where someone says, "Wait, what? He drove a car while asleep?" Yes, dear sleeper, and we encourage you not to attempt that in your dreams. Dream driving gets appalling gas mileage. Kenneth Parkes had a history of parasomnia, disorders that disrupt sleep, such as sleepwalking. Experts brought before the court explained that complex behaviors, like walking across rooms or even navigating obstacles, are not unheard of during deep NREM sleep stages. But driving a car, committing violence, and then surrendering to police, that enters the realm of somnambulistic folklore. His defense team mounted a daring argument. This wasn't murder. This was an act committed entirely without conscious awareness. He wasn't angry. He bore no ill will toward his in-laws. By all accounts, they got along quite nicely. If he'd been seeking revenge at 4:30 a.m., he could have just left a strongly worded post-it note. Parkes' behavior after the fact was curiously consistent with automatisms, actions performed unconsciously, no signs of deceit, no cover-up, just bewilderment. Witnesses spoke of his deep sincerity, and his brain scans revealed abnormalities suggestive of sleep disorders. And in an astonishing 1988 verdict, the jury found him not guilty. The court accepted that he had committed the acts while sleepwalking and thus lacked mens rea, the guilty mind required for a criminal conviction. Cue dramatic gasp, or, in our case, a polite yawn of legal curiosity. The Parkes case rippled across international legal waters faster than decaf at a retirement home. Critics worried it would set a dangerous precedent that anyone could claim ignorance due to nocturnal wandering. Yet, in the years since, similar cases have remained rare, and each one undergoes an intense, meticulous review. It turns out, faking sleepwalking is quite hard. The dreams are easy, but those brain scans, very chatty. So Kenneth Parkes wouldn't be imprisoned, but his life would never be the same. And Canada, ever polite and perplexed, continued to wrestle with the crossroads of medicine and law. Of course, Kenneth's case is far from the last time sleep raised its unconscious head in the courtroom. As we tiptoe deeper into our collection of drowsy defendants, Chapter 16 will gently unravel another nocturnal puzzle, one where a man's lover, a porch, and a mistaken identity all meet under the stars. Stay tucked in. The next tale is just around the REM cycle, in the dim corridors of the legal past, where law books gather dust like polite guests overstaying their welcome. A curious phrase has tiptoed into courtrooms with all the grace of a somnambulant ballet dancer, the sleepwalking defense. Now, dear listener, let us ease into the plush armchair of history and unfold yet another thread in this curious tapestry. How science began its cautious entanglement with the strange and sleepy phenomenon of parasomnia. Ah, parasomnia. A delightfully scientific word that sounds a bit like a rare orchid or something your Aunt Mildred once pickled for winter. Help yourself, dear. It's parasomnia with a touch of vinegar. But no, in this case, parasomnias are irregular movements, behaviors, emotions, or perceptions that occur while falling asleep, during sleep, or while waking. Sleepwalking is perhaps the most famous variety, the crown jewel in a mildly disturbing bedtime tiara. By the late 20th century, medical studies on sleep were becoming more refined, thanks in part to generous government grants and curious scientists with clipboards and an unusual tolerance for staying up late. Laboratories were starting to look more like futuristic lounges, soft lights, gentle humming machines, and volunteers half swaddled in electrodes. Sleep, it turned out, is not one long nap, but rather several stages cycled through in a sequence, like an academic's seating rotation at a tedious dinner party. Among these stages, the one known as NREM, non-rapid eye movement, became quite the star. It's here, in the mysterious in-between state of deep NREM sleep, that sleepwalking tends to occur. Remarkably, brain scans during episodes of sleepwalking revealed a paradox. The body is in motion, busy doing things like walking, eating, or unlocking doors with the wearied precision of someone who's forgotten why they came into the room, yet the brain is still largely asleep. Certain areas responsible for decision-making and self-awareness are, shall we say, off-duty. It's like the ship is sailing, but the captain is face first in his soup. As science furnished more data, the courts were offered a new kind of alibi, the polysomnogram. That's a fancy term for a detailed sleep test, involving a bevy of wires sprouting from one's scalp, and a whole night spent in a lab under the scrutinizing gaze of technicians. And here, dear dreamer, is where law and science met over a midnight cup of cocoa and tried uneasily to draft a truce. You see, for a sleepwalking defense to hold water in modern times, lawyers now had to prove three things. 1, that the accused truly suffered from sleepwalking. 2, that the episode fell under the category of involuntary act. And 3, that there was medical evidence to explain how this all came to pass during REM's slightly less glamorous sibling, NREM sleep. And oh, how the courtroom changed. Gone were the days of blustery arguments and finger-wagging barristers in powdered wigs. Now we had sleep experts summoned to the stand, delicately describing circadian rhythms to sleepy jurors, who, incidentally, struggled not to nod off during exhibits, including PowerPoint graphs of delta wave activity. One has to wonder how many courtroom sketches of these testimonies ended up featuring not suspects, but snoring onlookers. But perhaps the most curious part of this lofty scientific entrance was its impact on the opinion of the jury. Imagine being tucked into your box wearing an itchy jacket and holding a notepad, while a doctor in a bow tie explains that the accused was, quite literally, unaware of their own actions. Not criminally insane, he says, just asleep, entirely asleep. like a ghost trapped in a slow-moving body, cushions underfoot, with no recollection of what happened. Are you convinced? Or are you suspicious that sleep is being used as the grandest of all excuses since someone blamed the dog for eating their homework? It's a fine line, one that science does not always illuminate clearly, and thus judges, cautious creatures that they are, began to demand ever more specificity, a medical history, family patterns, evidence of prior parasomnia episodes, and, if possible, a sleep study conducted under observation. Oh, sleep, you trickster, offering nightly rest and occasional mischief. And so, the idea of someone's sleep becoming their alibi gained traction, but not uniformly. Some courts embraced it with scientific curiosity. Others regarded it with a touch of Victorian skepticism, as though parasomnia were a fashionable excuse used by fainting debutantes caught in morally ambiguous situations. Still, whatever their posture, the presence of science gave the sleepwalking defense new weight, one not built solely on character testimony and long monologues, but on buzzing machines, blinking monitors, and the ticking rhythms of the sleeping brain. Curious, isn't it? That sleep, intended as harmless rest, can sometimes walk the tightrope between innocence and guilt. But more on that delicate balance, and the judges who balanced it, when we tiptoe into chapter 17. Shh, settle in, fluff that pillow just right, and let the soft hum of history soothe your mind like a gentle ocean breeze coated in chamomile. Tonight's chapter takes us across the English Channel to 19th century France, a place of croissants, carousels, and curious cases of nocturnal nibbling, with a dash of criminal inconvenience. Now, when we think of sleepwalking crime, we often leap toward the dramatic. Murders, arson, maybe stealing someone's handbag and somehow galloping off on a unicycle. But sometimes, the history of sleepwalking criminality is less of a crime and more of an affable and edible curiosity. Allow me to introduce you to Monsieur Albert Bertrand. By day, Bertrand was a soft-spoken, mild-mannered Parisian clerk, the kind of man who would apologize if you stepped on his foot. But by night, by moonlight, he transformed, not into a werewolf, thank heavens. That would require a different kind of YouTube channel. No, Bertrand became a midnight gourmet, and not in the cooking sense, in the eating sense, the bizarre eating sense. Starting quietly in the winter of 1846, Bertrand was plagued by bouts of unconscious buffet behavior. His nocturnal activities included devouring blocks of raw butter, chugging vinegar, and once, memorably, gnawing on a scented candle. You know, for that floral finish. Upon waking, he'd find wrappers, crumbs, and the disturbing remnants of what he could only describe as gustatory horrors scattered about. At first, Bertrand blamed his roommate, then rats. Eventually, and rather reluctantly, he blamed himself. But surely, he thought, no man could willingly eat all the flour out of the bag with a spoon in the dark and not remember it. Surely not. So Bertrand consulted a doctor, a somber, broad-browed physician named Dr. Lemoyne, who preferred cravats to empathy and had a passion for neurology, back when neurology was more imagination than science. After a few erratic experiments that involved candles, watchful nights, and a regrettable incident involving pickled onions, Dr. Lemoyne declared, with great theatricality, that Bertrand was not mad, but rather, dramatically, a victim of somnambulistic ingestive aberrations. Sleep eating. To the surprise of no one today and the horror of polite 19th century society, Bertrand developed a following. Newspapers dubbed him Le Gourmet Fantôme. Children, doubtlessly with less than sympathetic curiosity, would leave treats by his door to see what the ghost eats next. A particularly mischievous baker claims Bertrand stole and consumed an entire uncooked fruitcake without apparent injury, which frankly deserves more scientific admiration than derision. But was it criminal? Well, Bertrand once broke into a neighbor's kitchen, mistaking their pantry for his own. The police were briefly involved. Fortunately, the neighbor had a good sense of humor and a dry toast fetish, and charges were dropped. But the event triggered a small, oddly polite debate amid French criminologists and philosophers. If someone, in the course of sleepwalking, consumes possessions that technically belong to someone else, have they committed theft, trespassing, or simply suffered a digestive tragedy beyond their control? While the philosophers sipped wine and argued in salons, Bertrand was sleeping under lock and key. By his own design, he began bolting his door, wearing little bells stitched into his socks, and sleeping next to extremely loud clocks. And thus, the sleep-snacking episodes eventually ceased. Monsieur Bertrand faded into history with minimal fanfare, his courtship prospects damaged only slightly by the lingering public memory of that time he tried to saute a shoelace. Still, his story remains charmingly nestled in the quieter annals of sleepwalking history, a reminder that not all unconscious misadventures end in courtrooms. Some end in indigestion and very confused roommates. And so, rested traveller of time will gently close the pantry door on Bertrand's curious nights and quietly pad barefoot into the next chapter, where things, as it happens, get rather less edible. In chapter 18, we'll meet a man whose somnambulant strolls took him somewhere, a little more chilling. Now, lean back. Bring your hands to rest, whether they're folded gently or tucked beneath a favorite blanket, and ease those furrowed eyebrows. We're heading to the south of France, sometime in the balmy early 1900s, where wine was cheap, air was lavender-scented, and one gentleman named Monsieur Albert Terveau would make legal history recounting a murder he didn't remember committing, because presumably he was asleep. Zut alors, right? Monsieur Terveau, a modest, mustachioed fellow of routine habits and questionable bedtime snacks, lived in a quiet provincial village. He worked clerical hours, kept his shirts buttoned, and, by all neighbors' accounts, was more beige than baguette. But one hot summer night, this beige-enhanced man dashed out of his home in naught but a nightshirt and a daze, crossed the dusty lane barefoot, and, in what some say was a somnambulistic fugue, fatally attacked his childhood friend Michel with a candle holder. Now, before we continue, a brief candle holder fact. In sleepy European households of this era, such objects were fairly solid implements. Less dainty, decoration, and more blunt instrument, should you be so inclined, or perchance asleep and unaware of your late-night wielding. In court, Monsieur Terveau stood trembling like a jar of unset custard and swore he remembered nothing. Not a flicker, not a struggle, not even putting down the candle holder. He only pieced together the horror after waking up the next morning still streaked with melted wax, and something far more incriminating. The village was aghast. Michel had been the choir director. His most alarming sin was a tendency to favor overly dramatic descants. But no one had ever feared Albert. He was the sort of man who apologized to cabbages at the market if he picked one too firmly. And yet, here he was, on trial for homicide. Now let's talk sleepwalking, a term the French refer to as le somnambulisme, which is best pronounced like you're drowsily chewing a marshmallow. By the early 20th century, science was cautiously poking around inside the world of dreams and unconscious movement. But still, the legal system struggled with these abstract ideas. A key moment came when the defense produced years of local testimony. Albert, it turns out, had been moonwalking long before Michael Jackson ever did it on TV. Villagers recounted tales of seeing Albert throwing bread rolls into the canal in his nightgown, as though feeding invisible ducks, or waking up to mysterious carrots in their mail slots. There was even a persistent rumor someone once saw him attempt a full-seated breakfast with no awareness and no trousers. But this case, unlike the breakfast, had gravitas. There were hushed debates among legal scholars, village crones, and journaling priests. Can a man be guilty if his conscious mind was off duty? The prosecution argued motive. Apparently, there had been an old disagreement between Albert and Michelle over hymn arrangements in 1897, which, if we're honest, seems a long grudge to hold both consciously and unconsciously. The case became a national sensation. Papers printed headlines like "The Killer Who Slept Through It All" and "Dreams and Demons in the Candlelight." The jury, warmed perhaps by Albert's earnest confusion and the truly damning lack of motive, voted to acquit. He was released back into society, though with a gentle suggestion that he install several locks, perhaps a bell, and maybe skip all future musical quarrels. Albert Tirveau never hurt another soul, and according to sparse village records, lived to a soft and silent old age filled with herbal tea and extra pillows. Some historians believe that his trial helped push the conversation surrounding automatism and criminal liability forward. Others believe it simply reminded an entire generation to take better care of their subconscious. Now, as our eyes begin to float like overripe grapes in the summer Rhone, we turn our gaze softly across the channel to sleepy old England, where a certain barrister would take somnambulism into far darker territory. In our next chapter, somewhere in the gentle suburbs of Toronto, under a sky marbled with clouds and cable lines, a man named Kenneth Parkes quietly shattered the perception of what courts thought they understood about sleep. He did it without shouting, without chaos, and, most confusingly, while allegedly asleep the entire time. It was a warm spring night in May of 1987. Kenneth, a 23-year-old father and full-time sufferer of extraordinary stress, stayed up too late watching television, his mind shadowed by insomnia and insomnia's unruly cousin, anxiety. Kenneth, you see, was at the rough end of a slide. He had lost his job. He was amassing debts. He had also reportedly been using gambling as a financial strategy, which, as history repeatedly suggests, rarely ends with parades and cake. That night, something strange happened. Kenneth got into his car, drove 14 miles across town to his in-laws' house, and in an act that horrified a nation, attacked them. His mother-in-law tragically died. His father-in-law was injured. And Kenneth, in a detail that has baffled sleep scientists and headline writers ever since, then drove to the police station and told the officers quite calmly, "I think I have killed some people. My hands." Not exactly the kind of thing you say in a dreamlike state, unless, of course, you are actually dreaming. The defense. Kenneth did it all while sleepwalking. Now, if that sounds improbable to you, you're in crowded company. But this chapter of judicial history is far from fiction. The defense called upon a battery of sleep experts, one of whom even installed electrodes on Kenneth's scalp and recorded brain activity during sleep that looked, well, more like a neurological light show than the usual humdrum of REM. The court proceedings were a blend of medical curiosity and legal skepticism. The prosecution suggested his actions were too complex, too violent, too coordinated to have been carried out while unconscious. The defense, with clips of Kenneth's guiltless demeanor and footage of him nervously fidgeting his way into thermographic scanners, argued that sleepwalking is not the tidy shuffling of pajama-clad cartoons, but could, in rare cases, turn dangerous. Now, here's where it tilts from legally fascinating to quietly absurd. Kenneth had no apparent motive. He adored his in-laws. There were no conflicts, no festering feuds over holidays or meatloaf. He also had no history of violence, except, tragically, in his sleep. Perhaps the most compelling note of all came from the sheer lack of cover-up. When the police picked him up, Kenneth's hands were bloodied, he had no alibi, and he offered no defense, except his brain had woken up before the rest of him had. In 1989, after months of testimony, brain scans, and attempted philosophical standoffs between neuroscience and legality, Kenneth Parks was acquitted. The jury concluded that he had indeed been sleepwalking, lost in a nocturnal fog thick enough to shroud both guilt and consciousness. The case drew international attention. Scholars mulled, night owls pondered, and the general public, many of whom had only sleepwalked to the fridge for cold pizza, squinted at the idea that sleep, in extreme forms, might be a legal excuse for such haunting action. So what does this tell us about the inner realm of sleep, or maybe the outer limits of courtroom reasoning? Perhaps that dreams, while typically relegated to pillow talk and poetry, can sometimes wander where they're least expected, into a courtroom wearing a suit. And what of Kenneth? He lived out a quiet life thereafter, steering clear of stress, debt, and late-night snacks. And the legacy of the case. It's taught law students, psychologists, and insomniacs alike that the human mind, in its twilight moments, can be as unpredictable as a floppy quill in the hands of history. As we tuck this chapter in and smooth its covers, the pillow-soft mystery of Kenneth Parks reminds us that even in the forgotten corners of our minds, where neurons whisper and dreams twist like smoke, history is quietly recording everything. In our next chapter, we'll walk, fully awake, I promise, into yet another peculiar courtroom where sleep, again, tries to plead the fifth. It's a case that rattled the southern states and added yet another wrinkle to the sleepy law books. Night-tuned minds, drift with me to chapter 20. Curl into your blankets, fluff up your pillow, and let's glide into a tale that's as baffling as it is drowsy. Tonight, we turn our lantern of historical inquiry toward the foggy twilight between waking and dreaming, via one particularly improbable evening in 1987. Canadians were famously polite, but this would test even their limits. Now, to Toronto, where a 23-year-old man named Kenneth Parks roused from bed into an altogether different kind of nightmare. Leading up to that May night, life had been less than restful for Parks. He was deep in debt, gambling compulsively, and unemployed, a toxic trio for insomnia. His relationship with his in-laws, however, remained strong. In fact, he had planned to confess everything to them, face the music, and presumably hear a few concerned sighs over dinner. But that calm evening spiraled into a legal and neurological puzzle worthy of a Victorian detective and a Swiss chronometer. At approximately 12:30 a.m., Kenneth climbed into his car, drove some 14 miles, that's about 23 kilometers for our metric-minded listeners, entered his in-laws' home with a spare key, and assaulted them, fatally in the case of his mother-in-law. All this according to Kenneth's own later account, without ever waking up. Yes, dear listeners, he stated that he was sleepwalking the entire time. Let's pause the plot to softly marvel at the logistics. Driving a car while asleep sounds like a deleted scene from a bed-themed spy movie. Psychologists call these complex automatisms, which is a gentle scientific way of saying your brain is running a program, but no one's at the wheel. Figuratively, though in Kenneth's case, literally too. When he did wake up, if that word can still be used, he noticed his hands were covered in blood. He was disoriented, horrified, but instead of running or hiding, he immediately drove to the police station and turned himself in. Said the words, "I think I have killed some people," like someone confessing to tripping over a shrub. Calmly, confused, as if emerging from a fog. And thus began the question that would dominate headlines and baffle more than one neurologist. Could a man actually commit murder while asleep? The defense argued exactly that. They even brought in sleep experts and electroencephalograms. Yes, those squiggly brain scans that look like seismographs at a caffeine tasting, to show evidence of a sleep disorder known as somnambulism. Parks reportedly had a family history of sleepwalking, and the stress-plagued cocktail of his lifestyle could have triggered what's known as a parasomnia episode. That's not just a fanciful term either. Parasomnia includes a grab bag of nighttime mischief, sleep eating, sleep talking, sleepwalking, even sleep driving. But violence? That's a rarer shadow. The defense built a compelling case, a detailed tapestry of plausible neuroscience, family history, and behavioral patterns. The prosecution, understandably skeptical, asked, but how could someone sleepwalk through acts this intricate? You see, the human brain is a peculiar instrument. Like a cathedral filled with monks, it can be simultaneously asleep in one wing and ringing bells in another. Some parts of the brain responsible for basic motor control and habits can remain active, even while the conscious mind is in dreamland. After considerable deliberation, probably while suppressing yawns, the court acquitted Parks of all charges, accepting that he had indeed been unconscious during his actions, and therefore not criminally responsible. The verdict sparked public debate. Was society safe if sleepwalking violence could be exonerated? Could this open the door for fraudulent use of the defense? Could we ever fully understand the mystery of a drowsy brain? In the quiet murmurs of neurology labs and the rustle of psychiatric journals, the debate continues. But for tonight, you can rest easy. The case of Kenneth Parks remains one of the rare instances in which sleepwalk murder met with legal absolution. As science and skepticism continue their slow waltz, we'll tiptoe into the next shadowy tale, where a sleep disorder intersected not with tragedy, but with intricate legal stagecraft. Tune in next time, as Chapter 21 drifts in with the dreamlike tale of parasomnia and the curious confession behind locked doors. Let's drift together, ever so lightly, into another quirky corner of our somnambulant saga. Tonight, our sleepy spotlight turns toward one of the most baffling aspects of sleepwalking murder cases: the confessions, or rather, the astonishing absence of them, and how that nudges lawyers and judges into a peculiar little legal dance. Now, just imagine it for a moment. You wake up on a couch that isn't yours. You're not entirely sure where you are. Perhaps your socks are missing, and there's an unsettling amount of pancake syrup on your face. There's no witness, no memory, and no note saying, "P.S. I did a crime." That's what makes these sleepwalking cases so fascinating and frustrating for everyone involved, especially the twitchy souls in the courtroom. Confession, in most criminal cases, is the gold standard, the shimmering North Star. But with sleepwalking suspects, the prosecution would have an easier time getting a coherent alibi from a squirrel. One man, let's call him Harold, because that's a fine and harmless name, found himself in this exact moonlit predicament in the 1980s. Harold awoke outdoors with a gash on his hand and police lights doing their gentle red and blue jazz in the background. A family member had been found dead inside, a tragic end to a quiet evening. When the police asked Harold what happened, he offered the worst answer possible: "I don't know." Which, though honest, and really something we'd all like to say in most Monday morning meetings, did not help the investigation. The lack of a confession often leaves courts in a legal limbo, because if someone is unaware of their actions and cannot confess to a crime they did not consciously commit, then what exactly are we judging them for? Their actions, their body, their unconscious mind, or perhaps the existential state of being human and occasionally unconscious? The term that courts began reaching for here, legs trembling beneath their wigs if they wore them, was automatism, a rather elegant word that sounds like a Victorian era dance, but in law it means a state in which a person has no control over their actions. There are two kinds: sane automatism, which is triggered by an external factor such as a blow to the head, or possibly drinking 3 lattes and watching election results, and insane automatism, which supposedly arises from an internal condition, things like epilepsy, or yes, sleep disorders like sleepwalking. Here's the kicker: if the court deems the sleepwalking to fall under insane automatism, that person could be found not guilty by reason of insanity, leading to possible psychiatric confinement, sometimes for longer than a prison sentence. But if it's judged as sane automatism, the person may be acquitted entirely as having no criminal liability. Nothing, zilch, no charges, and then possibly peace, tea and counselling. So when there's no confession, no deliberate act, and a person claims they were asleep during the act, the entire structure of the trial can feel like assembling IKEA furniture in the dark, with gloves on, and the instructions written in ancient Sumerian. Expert witnesses enter the scene like gentle owls of science, asked to peer into a brain retroactively. Could they have been sleeping? The attorneys softly ask, as if not wanting to wake the jury. The experts hesitate. Maybe, possibly. There's precedent, but as with all human behavior, it's not mathematics. It's more like baking sourdough without a recipe. It's in these cases that the judge's role inflates like an over-salted soufflé. They must not only interpret the law, but also transform into part philosopher, part DJ, spinning the records of morality, science, and precedent to hit the right groove. One full step, and you could end up criminalizing a condition millions quietly suffer from, or letting go someone whose unconscious behavior veers into the tragically dangerous. So what happens next? How do courts even begin to decide whether someone was asleep or just very, very good at pretending? That's where we'll be heading next. In Chapter 22, we'll tiptoe into the expert-heavy corridors of forensic sleep science and crack open a few curious case studies that dive into the dreaming brain, one EEG at a time. Until then, may your sleep be uneventful and your dreams fully alibi-free. Let's drift gently now into a time when sleepwalking was the toast of the legal town, and scientists and philosophers were really just people in wigs trying to make sense of something even mystery novels wouldn't dare touch. We're in the 20th century now. Yes, we made it. There are zeppelins in the sky. psychoanalysts in every drawing room, and an ever-growing pile of experts with varying opinions and very convincing moustaches. By this point in our tale of sleepy, possibly murderous people, we're circling the truly bizarre phenomenon of using sleepwalking and its buddy automatism as a legal defense. Ah yes, automatism. What a deliciously clinical word. So smooth, so neutral, so very useful in a courtroom. Now, while earlier centuries were content to blame demons, lunar phases, or simply weak character, the 1900s brought with them something far more dangerous: modern science. And nothing bolstered a curious legal defense quite like a neurologist with a clipboard and a diagram of the brain that sort of looked like a meatloaf. Across courtrooms in Britain, Canada, Australia, and of course, the ever-theatrical legal arenas of America, defense attorneys began to gingerly introduce the idea that their client wasn't guilty because their brain simply had the night off. They weren't conscious. They were under the smooth, sleepy influence of the subconscious. And that has a different zip code entirely, Your Honor. It was during this period, when Sigmund Freud was simultaneously being worshipped and misunderstood, that courts had to take a long, bewildered look at the question: can someone truly commit murder in their sleep? And if they can, who's responsible? The body? The brain? The pillow? One of the most whispered about cases of this era finds us in the cool, misty air of Canada in the 1980s. A man whose name sounds suspiciously like a placeholder in a psychology textbook claimed to have driven across town while asleep, killed his in-laws in a remarkably unpleasant fashion, and returned home, only becoming aware of any of it when the Mounties came knocking. Medical experts were divided, journalists delighted, and philosophers quietly chose that week to take a holiday. Could he really have driven, stabbed, and disposed, all while asleep? The defense called it non-insane automatism, which frankly sounds like something an especially clever robot would do during a software update. The prosecution, understandably, had their doubts. I mean, how convenient is sleep if it also lets you operate a vehicle, commit a felony, and avoid any memory of it? That's not somnambulism. That's an app we all wish we had during tax season. Eventually, after much pacing, pondering, and sipping coffee in solemn corners of the courtroom, the court actually acquitted the man. That's right, a full not guilty on the basis of sleepwalking. The public, it must be said, was stunned. Half wondered what this meant for justice. The other half, secretly, wanted to learn how to sleep like that. The case would go on to shape law in several countries, drawing delicate lines between conscious automatism, sleep-related violence, and the plain old garden variety evil. Judges now had to look a defendant in the eye and ask themselves, and sometimes expert witnesses, is this the face of a sleeper or a schemer in fleece pajamas? What emerges from this fog is a curious legal truth. The more we learn about the mind and what it does while we dream, the more wiggle room appears in our courtrooms. The line between criminal intention and unconscious action grows thinner, wobblier, and slightly more caffeinated. Still, it left many people uneasy. How do you prove someone was asleep during a crime, short of installing dream cams or waking them up mid-homicide? And how many sleepwalks are genuinely passive versus weirdly goal-oriented? These questions formed the foundation for more rigorous sleep science, sleep labs that watch people snooze behind glass like psychic fish tanks, and yes, more careful legal parsing. Because when it comes to criminal law, it turns out that being asleep is both a tragic alibi and a potentially perfect one. So rest easy, dear listener, as we tuck away this chapter in our blanket-lined legal archive. In the next soft whispered installment, we'll explore how modern forensics and brain mapping began to challenge the boundaries of sleepwalking defenses, even as nighttime violence marched on, slippers and all. To Chapter 23 we go, where the brain scans glow and credibility gets a CAT scan. The year was 1997. The internet was making its awkward teenage debut. Frosted tips topped the heads of many aspiring boy band lookalikes. And in Canada, one man would accidentally sleepwalk his way into legal history. This is the case of Kenneth Parks, a 23-year-old man, a devoted husband and father, a man with no criminal record who enjoyed sports, doted on his baby daughter, and suffered from chronic insomnia. Imagine that. A young father not sleeping. Startling. Kenneth had a particularly curious combination of insomnia and parasomnia, a kind of umbrella term that includes disorders like night terrors, sleep talking, sleep eating, and yes, the more dramatic cousin, sleepwalking. On May 23, 1987, Kenneth's parasomnia would crescendo into something neither he nor the courts nor Canadian dinner table conversations would ever forget. That quiet night, Kenneth, seemingly asleep, rose from bed. He got into his car, drove 14 miles from his home in Pickering to his in-laws' house in Scarborough, a feat rightfully considered absurd in the sleep legal community. Once there, he entered with a key he still had from friendlier days and brutally attacked his parents-in-law. Tragically, he killed his mother-in-law and severely injured his father-in-law in the process. Then, as if awakening from some nightmarish fog, he drove himself to a nearby police station, walked in barefoot, and said, in a sort of shocked daze, something along the lines of, "I think I may have killed someone." There were no attempts to flee, no tidy alibis, just a man covered in blood, befuddled and fully cooperative. Thus began one of the strangest legal journeys in Canadian court records. Now, to even begin mounting a sleepwalking defense, you need more than a good pair of pajamas and a sincere shrug. This isn't amateur night at the Dream Defense Theatre. The burden of proof is heavy, even when you're unconscious. Kenneth's defense leaned hard on the science of parasomnia. Sleep specialists were brought in. EEGs were conducted. Entire forests were likely mulched to print reams of brainwave data. The argument was this: Kenneth was not conscious of his actions. He'd been sleeping. And dreams, well, dreams are often strange, but they do not usually result in 14-mile drives and family tragedy. But this was not your average sleepwalker. Kenneth had a documented history of extreme sleepwalking, dating back to childhood. Add to it stress, fatigue, a rocky patch in his marriage, financial troubles, and, you guessed it, irregular sleep patterns. It was a bubbling cocktail that sleep experts said may have triggered a state of non-insane automatism. Now, automatism in the legal world refers quite poetically to actions performed by an individual who is not conscious of them. There's sane automatism, like fainting behind the wheel, and insane automatism, actions caused by a recognized mental illness. So what Kenneth's defense needed to show was that this was the former, not the product of deep mental illness, but of a rare and unfortunate sleep event. And somehow, shockingly, it worked. In 1989, Kenneth Parks was acquitted. He was found not guilty on all charges by a jury, convinced that he was indeed asleep during the events of that horrible night. The public, understandably, was riddled with disbelief. What kind of sleepwalker can drive a car, unlock doors, and commit acts of violence, all while unconscious? It's a fair question, but the brain is slipperier than a soap bar in a prison shower, And in rare cases like Kenneth's, it may construct a dreamlike state so complex, so disturbingly detailed, it mimics waking life, at least to the person doing the walking. Today, the Parks case remains one of the most cited examples in law school textbooks under criminal law, insanity defenses, and reminders that Canadian courtrooms are far more fascinating than maple syrup commercials would suggest. So what did we learn, dear bedtime traveler? That the mind is capable of terrifyingly complex behaviors, even in sleep, that legal definitions of responsibility must occasionally wrestle with the foggy world of dreaming, and perhaps that no one should keep spare keys to their in-laws' house while battling parasomnia. Now, as we gently stretch toward our closing chapter, we'll be whispering down the hallway of time into the curious realm where sleep, crime, and consciousness blur altogether. What is responsibility when awareness slips quietly out the back door? In chapter 24, we lie down with the lingering questions and drift into the soft unknown. And so, we arrive at the final flickering candle of our tale. You followed us through darkened hallways, foggy courtrooms, and centuries of sleepwalking suspects with surprisingly eloquent lawyers. Some claim the moon made them do it. Others, an ill-prepared roast turkey. Sleepwalking murder defenses have danced precariously between science, law, and a very human yearning to explain the unexplainable under oath. Which brings us here. Close your eyes if you like, and picture one last scene. A kitchenette in 1990s Toronto. A 40-something man named Kenneth Parks, nearly 6'5", in decent health, suddenly rises one early morning. He drives 17 miles to his in-laws' home, enters with his own key, and in a flurry of unremembered violence, leaves tragedy behind. Then, still confused and bloodied, he drives himself to the police station. "I think I've killed someone," he reportedly says in a daze. "My hands," he adds, holding them up, like a man who's only now realizing they're his. The crime was horrifying. His mother-in-law dead, his father-in-law injured. There appeared to be no motive. Parks liked his in-laws. He had financial stress, sure, old sports, gambling debts, a recent job loss, but no rage. No signs of tension. Nothing in waking life made sense of what happened. Now, you might think, surely the sleepwalking defense finally met its limit here. Au contraire. When his case went to trial in 1989, medical experts testified that Kenneth Parks had a family history of parasomnias, a charmingly old-fashioned term for all the things the brain gets up to at night when no one's watching. Walking, talking, cooking, driving, apparently even murdering. His EEG results, the brainwave showbiz of sleep science, displayed abnormalities consistent with sleep disorders. The defense mounted the claim that he'd been in a state of automatic behavior, acting without conscious control. And in a gently mind-bending twist, the jury believed him. Not guilty by reason of automatism. This was more than just rare, it was landmark. The case forever shifted the way Canadian courts view consciousness, criminal intent, and yes, what it means for a person's mind to be there. Now, courts across the world did not throw open the gates and declare snoozers safe from justice. Far from it. The standard remains high. It's not enough to mumble something about melatonin and hope for jury sympathy. Most cases fail this eerie defense, nor should it succeed without scrutiny. A little skepticism is the glue that holds bedtime stories and legal systems together. But Kenneth Parks remains one of the few whose real, honest-to-REM sleep defense succeeded, shocking everyone from the Crown to the couch-bound viewers decades later watching a documentary with equal amounts of popcorn and disbelief. And what's perhaps most fascinating, when you sift gently through the ashes of these cases, from 17th century England to modern Canada, you find yourself glancing not just at crime, but at a mystery even older. What is consciousness? Where does sleep end and wakefulness begin? Can you truly be innocent if your body did the deed? Perhaps that's the real reason these stories endure. Not because they're grisly, though they certainly can be, but because they ask questions we still don't fully know how to answer. And while the answers might be fuzzy, out of focus like the edges of a dream, humans, persistent, curious creatures that we are, keep trying. Admirable, really, and a bit exhausting. Now, as we tuck away this peculiar chapter of legal law, full of midnight stumbles through hallways and even stranger turns through the courtroom, we yawn, collectively, at the mysteries of the mind. The candles have burned low here at Boring History for Sleep. The judges and jurors of our tale have long since retired. Even Kenneth Parks is now older, greyer, out of the public eye. So rest easy, my friend. You've made it this far through suspect slumber and drowsy defendants. And when next we meet, we'll drift even deeper into one of history's quieter corners. Until then, let the gavel fall with a whisper, and the dreams take over.